Welcome to the Task-Based Flight Test Series. Please welcome your host from Cleared Direct. He's a real one percenter, Steve Cox.
I'm not sure that's a compliment coming from you there, Big Burn. Hey, it's Steve. Welcome back to the Task-Based Flight Test Series on Cleared Direct. I am Steve, and this is episode 3. We're going to talk flaps and the Pitot-Static check. The flow of this episode is we're going to talk about the pinned comment from last episode. Then we're going to get in very quickly talking about the flap test, because I want to save most of this episode for the Pitot-Static check, and it's going to be the first episode where we're going to dive into a lot of the telemetry or the flight data recorder, and I'm going to show you at the very end, after we've talked about Pitot-Static check, how to kind of work with that data, how to manipulate that, bring it into spreadsheets and all that. Okay, so let's take a look at the pinned comment from the episode 2, the maiden flight. My man, Richard Turner, winning the pinned comment once again. So from episode 2, he said, my 2 cents on the chase pilot is to keep it simple and do not complicate the situation further by having another plane involved. The average first-time home builder needs to focus solely on flying and recording data. I think the better option is cameras mounted in the cockpit as well as external cameras to capture footage for reference after the flight. The recorded audio and video is invaluable for testing purposes, especially combined with the data on the SD card from a modern EFIS. Thanks for the great comment. I would hesitate, though, on the first flight to put cameras outside of the aircraft. I didn't do that. I just don't think it's time on the first flight. If you're having an issue with flutter or there's a reason to point at a certain flight control outside the cockpit, then yeah, but first flight. But other than that, completely agree. Thanks again, Richard, for the great comment, and keep them coming. Let's see if you can make it the Triple Crown next week. So after the maiden voyage, which we covered in episode 2, the first real test of an aircraft system and aircraft performance handling characteristics is testing your flaps, right? Because you want to start integrating them into your actual approaches and landings. So we want to tailor the complexity of this test to the aircraft. The place I tend to start in developing a test is to identify failure modes. With a simple mechanical flap system like I have, it is pretty much limited failure modes to jammed flaps and asymmetrical flaps. On the other end of the spectrum, one of the most complicated lift enhancement systems I fly is the 737, with 2 types of leading edge lift enhancing devices and then trailing edge flaps, of course, which are double slotted Fowler flaps. They've got tracks, so if one track binds and the other doesn't, now you can have twist, you can also have jammed, you can have trailing edge flaps disagree, indications disagree, you could have the inability of them retracting. So with a complicated flap system like that, clearly you're going to have a lot more involved test. Likely your flap system complexity lies somewhere between mine and the 737, most likely probably closer to mine and a little bit more simple. So tailor the test and develop some emergency procedures to react to those potential failure modes during the test accordingly. And if you do have electric flaps, consider allowing time between actuations to let that motor cool. So of the 2 failure modes, I identified jammed flaps and asymmetric flaps. I consider asymmetric flaps to be the more severe emergency. The way I'm going to mitigate that or react to that, my emergency procedure, is I'm going to attempt to rectify it. If I cannot and I have to land with asymmetric flaps, and I'm going to conduct a controllability test. Referenced last episode, we talked a lot about the controllability test. Suffice to say, we're going to limit our airspeed on approach to the minimum airspeed we accomplished in the controllability check. Take a look at my flight test card. The objective is to ensure flaps operate as designed and gain for performance data without accomplishing a full stall. We're going to wait until we do some Pitot-Static tests and longitudinal stability tests before getting into full stalls. But I'm not going to get into this too much. I just wanted to kind of put it up on screen and show you so you have a reference. You're going to note some airspeeds for these are each of the 4 detents of flaps that I have. Okay, so look at the 1.4. If I reference stall speed, it's just, of course, we don't have a stall speed yet. It's just what your best guess of stall speed is going to be. But take a look at that. And if you have any questions, reach out in the comments. But I'd like to move on to the Pitot-Static test because it's a lot more involved and it's a lot more data gathering. And so we're going to spend the majority of the rest of the time on this episode in that phase. So once you're done with your flap check, you can even do it the same flight if you want. Then you're going to move on to the Pitot-Static check. So from a 30,000 foot view, what we're doing in this test is we're determining the error in our indicated airspeed by essentially working backwards. So back in ground school, you learned how to convert indicated airspeed to true airspeed using temperature and pressure. Well, today we are going to start with true airspeed, convert it back to indicated, and this is going to be your calibrated airspeed. The difference between the calibrated airspeed and what you're actually indicating is your error. You'll want to get data both slow and high speeds, and if you have a wide speed envelope of your aircraft, you want to get data every 30 to 50 knots in between the bottom and top, as well as you want to get different configurations, i.e. flaps down, because that's going to affect the static pressure around the outside of the aircraft. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking you should go straight from flap testing into stall testing. And to be honest with you, that's exactly what I did. The risk analysis I did went like this. So right off the bat, I felt very comfortable that my Pitot-Static system and pitch stability were good enough to support safe stall testing to enable approaches and landing, right? The bigger risk I thought was not having a stall speed and just go ahead and landing hot and fast so I avoid stalls at all costs, eating up a ton of runway. So I just opted to take that risk to execute stall testing, which we'll get to in a future episode. But the EAA in their flight test manual has it in this order, and that's what I'm going to stick to. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that no airplane's airspeed indicator is going to be 100% perfect, right? It's going to be off by a little bit. So why do we care about that little bit? If I'm consistently getting the same stall speed and same characteristics on an indicated airspeed, why do we care about calibrated airspeed? Well, I'll answer that question with another question. Do you care about true airspeed? Well, if you do, then you want to know what your calibrated airspeed is. You'd also want to see that if your indicated airspeed is in the ballpark, right? If we're spending all this time getting a calibration curve, why not be able to put that calibration curve into our modern Garmin or Dynon EFIS, right? We're essentially doing the same thing with the AOA curve. We're taking a coefficient of pressure, we're adding kind of a curve to that, and then we're deriving angle of attack from that. So why can't we do that same simple calculus for these modern avionics and display calibrated airspeed? I actually posed the question to Garmin, and writing up my email to my contact, I kind of answered the question to myself, which was liability, right? So if I do a poor job in calibrating or deriving my calibrated curve, airspeed curve, and I input into that system, you're going to potentially affect your safety by showing an indicated or calibrated airspeed that's actually incorrect. If that makes sense. But let's iterate that. What if we can add that calibration curve and hide it from indicated airspeed? You're still showing indicated airspeed, but only add it in when it calculates true airspeed. And that's my future request going forward. And they came back to me and they go, look, the difference between calibrated and indicated, it can be pretty big at low end airspeeds, but the higher you go, the error gets smaller and smaller, right? It's kind of an inverse relationship between error and airspeed, right? Well, stay tuned to the end. I didn't find that to be quite correct, so I might have an error in my system, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But I wanted to kind of pose that up top to start this discussion about indicated, calibrated, and true airspeed, and have you understand that true airspeed isn't derived just from the magic that it derives like winds and GPS and all this stuff. It actually starts off with your indicated airspeed, and it assumes that that is 100% accurate, and then it derives true airspeed from that, unfortunately. So it would be nice if we can add a correction curve to that. All right, let me zoom way back out to 30,000 feet. Let's reestablish the objective. It's to establish the error in our Pitot-Static system. Now, the way we do this is by collecting precise airspeed data over time and patterns that zero out any effect of wind. You have a choice of flying either on a zero wind day, good luck with that, or you can fly a triangular or a square pattern to average out the wind. I'm going to do both patterns because there ain't no non-wind days out here. If you don't have a modern avionics suite, you still need to do this. So you just need the outside air temperature, or you could probably just look at the 4 flight temps aloft over your airfield and trust those. And while you're there, take a look at the winds aloft to get an idea of what to expect. You'll need to record your GPS track, so you will need a GPS to do it, at least with this method. You could use 4 flight on your phone. You could use another device that has GPS tracking. And then that is to record your ground speed. Okay, write down the barometric pressure so that we can correct for pressure altitude, as well as true airspeed, and then you'll have all the data you need. I wanted to show you what's in a certified aircraft. This is the V35 Beechcraft Bonanza airspeed calibration. Normal system, meaning, hey, you're not in your backup emergency static system. Okay, so it is tight. Let me just say that right up front. So on the x-axis we have the indicated airspeed, and then the y-axis we have calibrated airspeed. And for this whole discussion, you can see 2 scales there. Doesn't matter if you're using knots, just use knots versus knots, miles an hour, or Scaramucci's. Doesn't matter what speed system you're using. But for this, it is pretty darn tight, right? 60, 70, 80. And so let's go to the extreme. So 198 or so, you're going to show, gosh, yeah, that is a tight system. You'll notice also that flaps down, there's a little bit more variation. So it's important to get your calibrated curve with all sorts of configurations. Super simple flight test card today, you guys. It's a lot more in-depth. I pretty much used the EAA's one, but I just created this as a spreadsheet to start working with my actual data, which I'm going to cover up. But I just want to point out a couple things. Risk is low, I determined, and threats, though, are the traffic, channelized attention, and cylinder head temperatures, because we're still breaking in this engine, of course, right? We're going to start taxi, take off, stabilize at an altitude, and clear the airspace. And then we're going to get set up to fly either a box or rectangular pattern, holding a precise airspeed and altitude. And then we're going to shake it up, change up the parameters. And then after we're done, we're going to shut down using the ignition key today. Just, again, something different, not pulling the mixture to idle cutoff. Note any anomalies using the ignition key. And then we're going to secure the SD card for debrief. We interrupt this montage for some really bad news. Unfortunately, all the content for the rest of the series is on this crashed hard drive. The good news is that the Pitot-Static check was pretty straightforward and rather boring. You just see me bumping around in some bumpy air, which is not ideal. But I'm hopeful that the hard drive will be recovered. I'm rushing it to Southern California to get fixed, and we should be underway shortly. If it's unrecoverable, then I'll just refly everything. Guys, welcome back to the debrief. Not a lot to see with me flying around out there. I really want to dive into the data and show you how we're going to derive all this stuff. So let's just jump right in. I will say that getting this information on a bumpy day is not ideal. I think that might contribute to some error that I'm seeing, some higher standard deviations. I'm also replacing the ADAHRs. Here is the actual ADAHRs that I just got back from Garmin. They had an RMA. I was getting some miscompares, and so I am not totally convinced that I was getting some errors from that. So I have to recalibrate this. We're going to do these tests once I get flying again, because I'm not flying quite yet. My shoulder is doing okay, but not that good. And we're going to get this on the airplane and do this again. Guys, if you're interested in how I collected the data, how I parsed through all this data, I'm going to save that to the very end of the episode, because I want to keep it focused on Pitot-Static right now and actually get to the data and numbers. And then I'll show you, I'll kind of like prove my work and show you later on how I did all that. So this is the first run I did, and there you can tell this one has 4 legs. So this was a box pattern, this one is a box pattern, this one's triangular, triangular, triangular. And you can see the data that I've pulled. These are my start and stop times, my indicated airspeeds on each run. So the average indicated airspeed for that run, my average ground speed, the GPS track, indicated true airspeed, which we don't really need. I'm just kind of validating or seeing what Garmin thinks my indicated true airspeed is. And heads up, it is pretty far off. So more on that in a minute. And then our pressure, altitude, and of course outside air temperature. So the baseline, I'll get to what this, so kind of disregard this for a second right now. But really what this is this is the average indicated airspeed I got. And then we want to grab our average ground speed. So if this test was done perfectly and the wind was consistent on every leg, then it should have averaged out, and this should be our true airspeed. So this is 81.0 knots ground speed. I put it through another data accumulator, which we'll talk to again at the end. It's just to validate it, and I got essentially the same thing. I'm pretty much either the same number or off by 0.1 in all of these. So that's just validating that no, it is in fact a good result. So I can consider this average ground speed to also be my true airspeed. Now we backwards convert true airspeed into calibrated airspeed. We go to this website. Of course, I'll leave the link in the description, and disregard the fact this says helicopter. This is actually a really good calculator because it goes from true to calibrated, which, you know, it's pretty hard to find a calculator that goes that direction. There's plenty that go the other direction. So we enter in what our true airspeed was. So let's just do it right here. So 80.9, average temperature was 7, pressure altitude 72.1. Look at that. And our average indicated airspeed was 69.8. Not bad, right? So let's do that again at a higher airspeed. Okay, we got 117 true, 97.7, 89.8. Wow, that's quite a bit off. Okay, we did it with triangular as well. So let's just accumulate all of this data down to here. Okay, so here's all the indicated airspeeds and here's all the calibrated airspeeds I got. And then I figured out what the error was between the two via percentage, and I charted it out. First of all, indicated versus calibrated. So the perfect line is the blue line. That's essentially 1-to-1 if your system was perfect. And then here's what I have. So all that is error underneath here. So you can tell the error is increasing as airspeed goes up, which disagrees with what Garmin told me should be the case. So and here it is presented in another way, right? This is just the error chart. So as the airspeed increases, the error increases as well. And but the trend line for the scatter chart, it's 95% accurate. Okay. So that brings me to a bit of a frustration. There's a couple things that I'm thinking. I'm either thinking I have installation error and my pitot tube is not pointed the right way, and I don't think so. Either my Adahars is bad and I'm swapping it out, not because I think it's bad necessarily, it's because of those miscompares, or I think my data might be bad. I think it was too bumpy, or I was just too inaccurate in holding airspeed, that I just need to find a smoother day. So is this safe to continue to fly in phase 2? Absolutely. Am I going to put it back in phase 1? Yeah, I'm going to put it back in phase 1, and I'm going to do a whole bunch more performance testing to validate this. So that's the conclusion I came up with. I'm getting at lower end airspeeds pretty low indicated airspeed or calibrated error in my indicated airspeed system, and then the faster I go, the higher the error up here is. So let's put a pin on that for a second. Let's talk about how to manipulate this data. First of all, your EFIS, you're going to want to ensure in the back end that data logging is turned on. And then for me in the Garmin G3X Touch, once that's on, I don't have to think about it. I shut down normally. The only thing I do have to remember though is I have to grab that SD card from the face of the G3X Touch, the GDU 460, the slot, and then you pull it out, bring it home, and then you've got your CSV files, which are comma separated value files. Let's show you what one looks like. You don't even have to import this into Savvy. I got all this stuff just straight from these spreadsheets. Your spreadsheet editor of choice opens up. And in my case, I've got Apple numbers, and it says the data was imported and the table can be adjusted. So let's open up a spreadsheet that I've already manipulated. And it's important to have your start and stop times of each of your runs, so that then, of course, you can go back and reference it. Whether it's in local time, I actually created a new column here called Savvy Time. We'll talk about this when we get to Savvy, because essentially it starts at 0 at the local time that you turn your avionics on. So it goes up, just counts up from 0. But regardless, we have our indicated our ground speed, our track, our altitude pressure, our outside air temperature, and track you really don't need by this method. That just helps me with this right here. So the validation. Let's just talk about the track for a second. So there's a great paper called Using GPS to Determine Pitot-Static Errors, and it really walks you through, it's from a gentleman at the National Test Pilot Schools. He walks you through the basic concept, and what we're doing with that track direction is we're actually mathematically creating the vectors and letting the spreadsheet do all the math, and then backwards deriving a true airspeed from ground speeds. Okay, so here's an example of 1, 2, 3, 4 test runs with the ground speed or GPS velocity, and then the track, and then it gives you a true airspeed based upon that. The spreadsheet that I downloaded from the National Test Pilot School, the 4 legs worked, but the 3 legs didn't work, so I actually built it myself. This is the triangular, the 3 legs, right? So you got your speed and track direction, speed and track direction, speed and track direction, and it assumes you're flying the same indicated airspeed, and then it gives you a true airspeed, and then you actually can see wind speed and direction and bounce it off of the actual hard data over here, wind speed and wind direction, and see if your EFIS is actually anywhere near correct. And I've found that recalibrating my magnetometer helped, and something's up because these aren't quite matching. So we're still going to get to the bottom of it. And really the only thing that is affecting me is with true airspeed, once again, because my indicated airspeed isn't correct. But I find myself wondering, hey, what am I actually doing? I would love to go find a no-wind, non-bumpy day and do all these tests and just treat my ground speed as my true airspeed. Listen, guys, I realize that was a ton of data, and it's going to generate some questions, so please leave them in the comments, and I will address them in the beginning of the next episode, where we're going to get into longitudinal control, pitch stability. I'm really excited for that episode. Till next time, it's Steve, you're cleared direct.